Serious. People who have witnessed a violent death. How was your experience? Story 1. I'm a rescue diver and trained in first response living in Hawaii. Was at the beach one day with some friends and saw something floating about 200 yards out of the beach. I immediately jump in the water. I don't think I've ever swam that fast. Got halfway there and my fears were confirmed. It was a body floating face down. Got him and flipped him over, started towing him in as fast as possible and talking to him, telling him it'll be alright. Didn't even notice how swollen and blue his face was until I got him on the beach and attempted CPR. He was pronounced dead immediately. I'll never forget his eyes. Since then I've seen some things worse than that, but I was 18 and I'll probably never forget that one. If the waves are big and you don't know what you're doing, don't get in the freaking water. If you're drinking, don't get in the freaking water. Story 2. When I was in the Peace Corps in Ghana, I saw a man stoned to death. He had stolen a taxi from a nearby city and brought it to the village I was staying in. Unfortunately for him, the man he stole the taxi from was from the village he brought it to. I'm not sure how he didn't know this, as it seemed everyone knew everyone in the surrounding villages and cities. The villagers ganged up on him and stoned him in the street. Men, women, and children all participated. It was a very strange, surreal experience and horrifying. None of the volunteers knew what to do. All the Peace Corps volunteers in the village received counseling to process. It's been over 10 years and I still think about that day often. Story 3. When I was 19, I worked the graveyard shift at the gas station. We were located in a very busy street that was home to a lot of bars and clubs. On this particular evening, one of the 3 of my friends stopped and bought some donuts and stopped by to hang out with me. Shortly after 2 a.m., we saw a crash. A huge Ford truck had T-boned a tiny 4-door sedan. 2 of the 4 girls inside the car died instantly in the crash. One was unconscious. We went outside, called 911, and tried to keep the other girl calm. Her screams are what haunt me to this day. She was begging her friend not to die and would talk to her about random things only to realize after a couple of seconds that her friend was dead. She did this a couple of times, and her screams were heartbreaking. The girl who hit them was trying to turn her car on to get away, but a homeless man who I had befriended grabbed her out of her truck and kept her there. She was crying and begging the homeless man to let her go because she didn't want to go to jail. It was the first time I'd ever seen a dead body, and for a couple of days, I felt like I was floating, like nothing really was happening to me. I was just living but not really there. A couple of weeks later, one of the 2 girls who survived came into the store to thank me and my friends for calling 911 so quickly and keeping her company. Apparently, they had just left a bar and the driver was the only one who hadn't had a drink that night. They were celebrating. She had just secured a new job and was going to be on a plane the next Monday to go to her new home. The girl who hit them was a 22-year-old. She was drunk and speeding. I don't know what kind of sentence she got, but I told the officer that took my statement that she was trying to leave. Don't drink and drive. Love those who you love. They may not be there the next second. Story 4. My friends and I used to play by this creek. My cousin's house backed up to the woods and the creek was about a mile deep behind their home. We played by there pretty much every day during the summer. One thing we used to do was swing from one side to the other with a rope swing we made. One day we were swinging and one of our buddies, Josh, slipped. It wasn't super uncommon to slip. You usually just fell in the creek, got wet, and went home and changed later. This time was different. Josh fell backward and ended up hitting his head perfectly on those large rocks that were by the edge of the creek. The impact was so bad and he was bleeding profusely. My brother jumped in to make sure he didn't drown. I ended up running back to my aunt's house with one of my cousins and a friend. My brother, another cousin, and another friend stayed back. We got help, but it was too late by that point. It was just a freak accident. We fell so many times off that stupid swing and nothing ever happened. He just fell wrong that day and it ended his life. I could hear his parents' screams from my aunt's backyard when they got back there. It was awful. Story 5. Walking home from school age 12. Some of the rougher lads in my year were forever roughing up this one lad, pure bullying like. On that day, they chased after him. I was a pretty geeky introvert and walking with my equally geeky friend, so we were just walking hoping the rougher, tougher lads didn't take exception to us. They chased him about 100 yards ahead and sort of had him on the ground, giving him a bad time like kicking and hitting. Not majorly beating his ass, but it must have been horrible for him. They got bored and let him go. He jumped up crying and ran off like a shot. Thinking it was done, the rough lad swaggered off and all of a sudden, the lad they had beaten up came running down the road and launched a house brick at the group with him. It hit this one lad straight in the head, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. The lad who threw the brick ran off, and everyone went into an absolute panic trying to wake the unconscious lad up. Being 12, no kid knew what to do. Some staff from a nearby care home came out and tried CPR, but he was dead. Story 6. My cousin killed another person in self-defense. We were at a club and in the parking lot when another group of people start arguing with my cousins. We were heading away when one guy gets out and kicks the car and spat on it. He He then runs back to the passenger side of his vehicle and my cousin gets out yelling at him. The guy pulls a gun and fires but missed. During this, my cousin pulled his gun but did not miss. He was charged with murder, but being a concealed carry pistol holder, voluntarily turning himself in, multiple shells in the ground, eyewitness statements, and other things, he was found not guilty eventually. Story 7. I was standing in a gated smoking area at the back of a bar one Saturday night. I was smoking and talking to a friend and random people. When out of the corner of my eye, I could see two guys walking up from a parking lot outside of the gated area. I didn't think too much about it because I was tipsy, and no fights or aggressive behavior was occurring that night. When the two guys got to the gate, which was waist height, they climbed over and just stood there. At the time, I thought they were sneaking in to avoid the cover. Then calmly, one of them walked up to some guy in the crowd and shot him in the back of the head behind the ear. The only thing I could compare it to was a streaming blood found from the nose, mouth, and a bullet exit, maybe. The guy didn't drop like in the movies. It seemed like an eternity, but the problem was only a few seconds. He stood there with 80s-style special effects blood spraying in the smoking area. Everyone ran, except for me. I was in complete shock and stood there eyes wide. I remembered going to put the cigarette in my mouth when I tasted something funny. I looked down and blood splatters were on my arm, shirt, and cigarette. I scrubbed myself that night, as you see in the movies where someone feels they can't get clean. I couldn't get the image of the bloody cigarette and taste out of my mind for a couple of days. Story 8. I am a combat veteran and have witnessed plenty of violent deaths, but one that I guess stands out happened in late 1969. My unit, 12th Cavalry, was conducting operations right along the Cambodian border, clearing the area of NVA, North Vietnamese Army troops. This was in the Binh Long province. Well, one day we were clearing this small village, and this was my second tour, and two recruits named Private McLaughlin from Long Island and Private Storm from Wyoming, and another guy on his first tour, but had been in Vietnam for a few months. PFC Romano from San Fran had to clear this small hut. Anyway, we break down the door, and Storm walks in first and gets shot immediately in the stomach. McLaughlin just sprays the inside of the house, but when he runs out of ammo, he drops his gun and just runs inside the hut. McLaughlin was a stupid hothead and was best friends with Storm, so I think he went inside the hut to drag him out. Well, I and Romano were at the bottom of the staircase heading up to the hut. We had ducked when the first round of fire broke out. Well, now we're hauling ass up the stairs after McLaughlin because he just charged into a house without his goddamn weapon. Well, we hear screaming. When we enter the house, we see McLaughlin in a hand-to-hand fight with this NVA soldier. We can't shoot because he and McLaughlin are constantly shifting positions, and we don't want to shoot McLaughlin. I start screaming at McLaughlin to let go of him and get away so I can shoot him. Romano went to Storm and dragged him out of the hut. But McLaughlin wasn't listening and was just screaming all this mind like, "Screw you, you goddamn gook!" and all these other profanities at the top of his lungs so he couldn't hear me. Well, he ends up pulling out his bayonet to stab the guy, but then he grabs onto McLaughlin's throat. Then McLaughlin tries to stab him in the throat, but just gets him in the shoulder and they both collapse. I still can't shoot because McLaughlin is blocking my view. I can see the NVA soldier's hands gouging at McLaughlin's eyes though. McLaughlin just starts stabbing with so much rage and venom and is screaming like a madman. The NVA soldier is screaming too. But this time, another group of guys had come into the hut with all the commotion. Well, McLaughlin just starts slashing the guy's throat and face for a few seconds before the NVA soldier finally dies. McLaughlin keeps stabbing him though, and hitting him, and finally, we guys have to pull off this corpse that looks like a Jack the Ripper victim. His throat and face were practically cut open. His chest was just tomato juice. Even I couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds. I later slapped McLaughlin for being a freaking idiot and putting himself and other men in danger by charging into the house without a firearm. McLaughlin ended up being a total nutcase, and I think that one really messed him up. He became way too violent and unpredictable, and after 3 months he got a court-martial for stabbing another soldier. Storm survived though. He never came back to Vietnam. No idea what happened to either of them after Vietnam. Story 9. I was doing security at a celebration for the Indianapolis Colts and was walking through an alley downtown when a guy who had jumped off the pool deck of a hotel landed about 5 feet away from me. I stood in shock for a few seconds and then walked over to him. He had a compound fracture of his leg, but it wasn't gory at all, just a bit of bone sticking out of the skin. There was a small stream of blood going from his head toward the curb. Maybe 30 seconds later, a few policemen and my supervisor came running around the corner and took over. It affected me pretty badly for about 24 hours. But then the news broke that he was a child who jumped when the cops were closing in on him. The moment I heard that, I was fine. It was like it never happened. Story 10. It was 9/11/16. I was going to the airport to pick up my wife. As we pass one of the parking lots, the car in front of me slams on its brakes. I throw up my arms like, what? At that point, my 8-year-old daughter says to me, "Daddy, that plane just crashed." I looked to my left and sure enough, a small plane crashed in the parking lot 50 yards from us. I immediately pulled over and told my daughter to wait in the car. I bolted out and headed towards the crash. A handful of people were in the vicinity, kind of in shock. I have some first responder training and felt like I had to help if I could. I was the first one to approach the crash. The plane was upside down and there was airplane fuel everywhere. Cars were smashed all around it. I foolishly stood in fuel as I assessed the situation. I'm not proud of that. The first person I saw must have been the pilot. His upper body was dangling down and his lower half was trapped in the mangled metal. I yelled out to him, "Can you hear me? Do you need help?" No response. I moved to the other side of the plane where I saw the second person, a woman, handcuffed, dangling much in the same way as the pilot. She was also dead. As I peeked my head around the crumpled metal, I found the third and final person. He was in the worst shape of all. That day changed my life. I had always wondered how I would respond to something like that. One part of me is relieved I didn't shy away. I went right up to the front line to help. The other part of me wonders what would have happened had a spark lit that fuel. Story 11. A friend and I had been mowing yards most of the day. We were in high school. He could buy beer. We stopped at the store and I noticed a car parked on the side of the store. A man in the car was yelling at a woman inside the car. We got our beer and my friend lived 3 houses away, and we sat in the porch cooling down and having a beer. The car sped away from the store and went out of sight. In a couple of minutes, it was back. The yelling continued. The woman got out of the car and the car sped away again. I thought that was strange. There was a side street that started right across from my friend's porch. The car turns onto that street and stops on the wrong side of the street, in front of a house set back from the street a little bit. The man in the car opens the door and steps out. He's standing in between the car door and the seat, yelling at the house now. He was yelling in Spanish, so I couldn't understand what was being said. A man comes out of the house. He's not saying anything back to the yelling man. The man turns around and goes back into the house. My friend and I think that's the end. In about 20 seconds, the guy comes back out, levels a .22 revolver at the man in the car, fires once, sees the man drop, and goes back into the house. My friend and I can't believe what we just saw. We cautiously make our way over to the man lying in the street. No one comes to the house door, so we check on the man at our feet. I stoop down, and no pulse. He's got one tiny hole in his temple. A tiny trickle of blood about 2 inches long runs out of the hole. That's it. He's dead. No pulse, he's not breathing, no moaning, just nothing. We sat there with him till the cops came. We said we heard the shot and saw the guy walk away into the house, and that's it. We didn't say we saw it all. The man in the house admitted what he did. The cops let us leave and we went back to the porch. My friend understood Spanish. He told me that the parts he could hear were about infidelity. We finished our beer and watched what went on for about an hour while we finished our beers. The whole thing from store to dead didn't take 5 minutes. I saw that day how easy it was to be killed and how fast you could die. I'm in my mid-50s now, and I remember it as it happened an hour ago. All I'm going to say is it changed me. I think I was 16. Story 12. Not sure if I'd say violent, but traumatizing. My mom and dad were cooling off after an argument. My dad was giving me lunch in my high chair. I was almost 3 years old. My mom was in another room of the house and was giving my dad the silent treatment. My dad had a heart attack and died right in front of me while I sat strapped in that high chair. My mom has no idea how long he'd been dead by the time she heard me screaming and crying. I don't remember the incident. I remember the funeral home and other bits and pieces around that time. I had a strange fascination with death after that. I would have panic attacks and have what I believe were psychogenic seizures. I just black out when I thought about death too much. Story 13. First time I've experienced death. It wasn't as violent as it is more traumatic, but no child or parent should go through what I saw and experienced. I was in an outpatient facility for treatment when they rushed in a toddler, and I could hear the nurses saying code blue. The baby was stiff and purple. From the looks of it, the baby could have suffered from convulsions or seizures of some sort. They weren't able to usher me out of the area fast enough as every available nurse and doctor was trying to revive the little girl. Mom was hysterical and inconsolable. The kid was a mere 1 to 2 feet away from me. The doctors eventually stopped life-saving procedures and wheeled the kid and family away. From what I can understand, the kid died of measles and was days away from a scheduled vaccination. One day the kid was fine and the next, her condition deteriorated fast. Story 14. I was a bystander who tried to assist with what was described by the detective as an incomplete My neighbor across the street set his house on fire and then went out on his yard and shot himself in the chest. It was one of the first people on the scene to start helping. I'm not a medical professional, but everyone else was just standing around gawking at the flames. The fire wasn't that bad when I got to him. It was still in the back part of the house, so I kneeled next to him, got on the phone with 911, and started following their instructions. They had me check for vitals. He was still breathing, but very weirdly. Then they had me elevate his bloody neck to help clear an airway or something. He inhaled deeply and it made this ungodly noise. I'm guessing it's what people mean by death rattle. Then he exhaled and sprayed a mist of blood all over me. Meanwhile, much to my surprise, house fire spread freaking fast. In flames, it engulfed the porch maybe 10 or 15 feet away. It was hot enough to be uncomfortable. Emergency responders were taking their sweet time to get there, or at least that's how it seemed. It was probably just time slowing down for me. The firemen get there and start hosing the place down, but no emergency medical technicians were there. I was literally screaming at them to come to help this guy. Eventually, someone showed up to relieve me and get him to a hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital, which means he probably took his last breath while I was cradling his head to try to help him breathe. The cops grilled me like a suspect on my way out, which was also kind of traumatic. They wouldn't tell me what the guy's condition was, how the fire started, or even that he was the one who pulled the trigger. So I went home thinking there might be a gun-wielding maniac arsonist stalking the neighborhood. I finally got all that info and the detective on the case made me do a phone interview, but they still wouldn't tell me the guy's name, which I still don't know. Didn't even make the papers as far as I saw. All in all, it screwed me up pretty badly. I flunked a semester of school, later got it retroactively changed to medical withdrawal for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, but the tuition money was already wasted. I also got a cough for a few days afterward, from breathing in God knows what. I've never been in a position to help a gravely injured stranger since then, but weird as it sounds, I doubt I'd do it again. It made no positive difference to the victim. I was treated like a criminal, and nobody even cared enough to remember the guy who was so miserable he felt like burning down his house and killing himself was the best option. And for my trouble, I got nightmares and PTSD, and weird behaviors like making sure I always had a knife close at hand. It did give me a lot more respect for first responders, though. Story 15. I was on the train when someone jumped into it. It wasn't so visual, but you physically felt the train run over them. They didn't die right away, and we were in between stops, more rural area. So you could hear him, and the back car had to move up because they could all see him. We all had to sit in the train for 3 hours until police escorted us down the track half a mile to the next station, since it was now part of an investigation. It sucked and shook me. It has since happened 2 more times. It still is awful and you feel awful, but you also really start to get pissed off at the person who did it for screwing up your day and giving you that memory. Story 16. I was in Aruba vacationing in the summer of '95, chilling out at Eagle Beach. So I see a Sea-Doo with a kid at the controls and a dad riding shotgun. They're going at quite some speed, and are looking and waving at mom who was standing next to me, filming them with a handycam. So I see a speedboat slowly leaving shore and it's evident he's going to cross paths with the Sea-Doo. I scream and wave at the Sea-Doo pointing ahead of them, but they still don't look ahead. The boat, about 20 feet with a huge outboard, slams into reverse. But a second later, the Sea-Doo collides into its port side. The collision was so hard the boat got lifted almost vertically in the water. The kid flew off the Sea-Doo and slammed his head and face into the boat. Mom's screaming, probably filmed the whole accident. Next thing I know, the water sports rental guys jumped on the wave runners and raced to the scene. They grabbed the kid by his life jacket and lifted him onto a wave runner and rushed back to shore. No regard for safeguarding his C-spine, but it was all out of panic. They land right next to me and lay the boy on the shore, unconscious, bleeding from both ears and his nose, and he didn't have a tooth in his mouth anymore. Dad came to shore in the other wave runner. The collision was so hard that his swimming trunks got ripped off his body. Dude standing there naked except for the life jacket and screaming desperately at his son to wake up. We finally lifted the kid onto a lounge bed, pushed him into a pickup truck, and rushed him to the hospital. But to no avail. I think the kid died on impact, and if he hadn't, they probably killed him when they hoisted him on the wave runner like that. My body almost fainted. I was shocked and very, very saddened because of the whole situation. The parents' cries were just heartbreaking. Story 17. Saw a pedestrian get hit by a tractor trailer. It was bad. She was decapitated, and the smell was something I will never forget.